red shawl lay shredded in the dirt, torn into jagged ribbons like it had been dragged through a patch of mesquite thorns. Lydia knelt on one knee, clutching a rough brown blanket tight across her shoulders. Her skin was pale, her breath uneven, but her eyes, those eyes burned steady, filled with something fiercer than fear. It was the look of a woman who just had the world take something it never had the right to touch. Only moments before, the summer sun over Redstone Ridge had been scorching hot enough to fry eggs on an iron pan. The air shimmered, and the smell of horse sweat and dust hung thick. The main street was alive, boots thudding on porches, deals whispered over sacks of flour, the hum of small-town life. Then 3 riders rolled in, spurs jingling, hats pulled low, dust caked across their coats. No one asked who they were. They didn't need to. The street went dead quiet, like someone had sucked the very life from the air. Lydia had pleaded for just a few more days to pay the money she owed. Business at her small bakery had been slow. Too many debts, not enough hungry mouths walking through her door. Still, she'd stood tall, chin up, voice steady, hoping maybe reason could soften cruelty. The lead rider didn't argue. He just grinned, cold, cruel, and swung down from his saddle. His hand shot out, gripping her arm so tight she gasped. Then right there in front of God and everyone, they tore her dress wide open. The sound of ripping fabric cracked through the heat like a whip. The sheriff stood nearby, an old man whose hand hovered over his holster, trembling but never drawing. Around him, the men of Redstone Ridge stood frozen, knuckles white, eyes narrow, faces dead calm. Each remembered what happened to those who tried to stand up. Barns burned, herds slaughtered, brothers buried before sunrise. The riders laughed as they mounted up again, tossing the torn cloth onto the ground like it was trash. Their hooves clattered away down the street until the only thing left was the squeak of a swinging saloon door. Lydia stood there under the blazing sun, gathering what was left of her dignity and her shredded dress. And somewhere in that silent crowd, someone made a choice. That someone was Colt Rayner. He wasn't in town when it happened. He'd been hauling feed back from his ranch at the edge of Redstone Ridge, the kind of ride that leaves a man soaked in sweat and silence. By the time he reached town, the whispers had already started. Folks were turning away, shame thick in their throats. He asked the stable boy what went down. The boy couldn't even look him in the eye, just mumbled about 3 riders and walked off. That's when Colt felt it, a slow, heavy fire building deep inside. He'd seen rough times before, lost his wife to fever 5 winters back, buried her under the one cottonwood tree that still grew green on his land. Since then, he'd kept to himself, fixing fences, mending saddles, avoiding other folks' troubles. But Lydia wasn't just other folks. He'd been stopping by her bakery for months, telling himself it was for the biscuits. Truth was, it was for her. Her quiet strength, her way of smiling through hard days. And now, someone had tried to crush that. That night, Colt sat on his porch under a cold moon, listening to the crickets and the far-off howl of a coyote, the kind of silence that asks a man who he really is. In a town where law was only a rumor and fear was the sheriff, decent folks learned to survive by looking down. But Colt knew if you kept looking away long enough, one day there'd be nothing worth looking at. By sunrise, he'd made up his mind. This wasn't about revenge. It was about what kind of town Redstone Ridge was going to be when the next generation came along. A week later, the heat came early. Folks were setting up stalls, wagons creaked, crates hit the ground with dull thuds. Then 2 riders appeared. Not the full gang, just a pair. But their swagger said they thought 2 was plenty. They strutted down the street, taking coins, pushing folks around. When one of them leaned in too close to a young woman selling eggs, Colt stepped out from an alley. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He just walked slow, steady, boots thudding in the dust. "Let her go," he said. His voice was low, steady, enough to make the crowd freeze. The rider laughed. A heartbeat later, that laugh turned to a grunt as Colt's fist smashed into his jaw, dropping him flat. The second man reached for his pistol, but before he could draw, another voice cut through the air. "Not today." It was Jed, Lydia's father, standing behind a barrel with his old rifle leveled and steady. That was all it took. The blacksmith stepped forward with his hammer. The merchant raised his shotgun. The farmers, the drifters, even the old widow from the boarding house, each one stepped up. The riders looked around, realizing the tide had turned. They climbed back on their horses and rode out. But everyone in Redstone Ridge knew this wasn't over. That afternoon, they gathered in the saloon's back room. They planned, they prepared, and they waited. And they came back 3 days later. You could hear 'em before you saw 'em. Hooves pounding like thunder, the clatter of rifles. This time, it wasn't 2, it was 10, maybe more, riding side by side like a storm rolling in. But Redstone Ridge wasn't the same town anymore. Behind wagons, behind barrels, townsfolk crouched ready. The blacksmith gripped his hammer. The store owner held a shotgun. Even old Miss Dyer had a cast-iron skillet in her hand like she meant business. The riders slowed their horses near the saloon, and then it began. From the rooftops, bags of flour burst open, blinding them in a storm of white dust. The rest charged forward, only to be met by the crack of rifles, the swing of hammers, the roar of voices that had been silent too long. One bullet hit true, knocking a rider clean off his horse. The rest froze, realizing this wasn't just Colt standing against them anymore. This was the whole damn town. From every doorway, from every alley, folks stepped out, eyes hard, hands steady. Colt stepped forward, slammed his hammer handle once into the ground, and said, "Come back here again, and there won't be a way out." He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The silence that followed spoke louder than gunfire. The gang's leader spat in the dust, glared at Colt, then turned his horse around. They rode out slower than they came in, like men who'd finally met their match. Redstone Ridge was quiet again. Not the scared kind of quiet, the kind that means peace. Lydia crossed the street toward Colt. Her dress was torn, her hands trembling, but her head was high. She didn't say anything, just looked at him, eyes soft, grateful.
he gave a nod, a small one, the kind that said everything words couldn't. Days passed. The bakery opened its doors again. Kids played in the street. Folks smiled without glancing over their shoulders. Colt went back to ranching, but every morning he stopped by Lydia's bakery, sometimes for bread, sometimes for pie, mostly just for the company. It wasn't some grand romance. It was something quieter, stronger. Two souls who'd known loss, finding comfort in simply not being alone anymore. Maybe that's what this story is really about. A town doesn't change because one man stands tall. It changes when everyone decides fear's had its turn. So tell me, friend, if you'd been standing there in that dusty street, would you have stepped forward or waited for someone else? If you enjoyed this ride through the old frontier, give it a like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more. And before you ride off tonight, click that hype button below to help us keep bringing these stories to life for you. Until next time, keep your hat low, your heart steady, and your word true.